Mandelman is the Director of Research of the Research Department and the Senior Scientist here at the aquarium, as well as research faculty at UMass Boston. John first arrived at the aquarium in 2001 when he instantly took on an internship in the research department while a doctoral student in biology at Northeastern University. And here he is 13 years later. In addition to directing the research department, John is responsible for an independent research program studying the effects of human impacts on stress levels, health, and survival in marine fishes, especially sharks. He may actually look familiar to you as he was the host of our Shark Research Confessions lecture back in early May. The overriding goal of his work is to provide data to strengthen the management and conservation of vulnerable and important marine fish species. With that, please welcome my colleague and speaker for this evening, Dr. John Mandelman.
Thank you very much, Gina. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk a little bit about a species near and dear to people's hearts in this region, Atlantic cod. On that note, I wanted to just start out by just seeing a show of hands on people that fish for recreation, who tend to like going out fishing for recreation, avid recreational anglers. Nice. Any commercial fishers in the audience? Okay, excellent. Yeah, so the reason I bring that up, besides wanting to get an idea of how many of you have some context on which to base this talk, I also, as Gina mentioned, I do a lot of work on sharks and stingrays and their close relatives, the skates. So cod are, in the last couple of years, fairly new species for me to work on. I'm still learning myself, but it's been fascinating to kind of get engrossed in this topic area and learn a little bit about the recreational fishing side, which tends to be ignored quite often in this field. So we'll learn a little bit about that tonight. So just to start out, if you're familiar with the lecture series, if you come to these lectures regularly, you'll see that there have been past lectures that have addressed cod as well, the species as well. They haven't necessarily focused exclusively on cod, but they've talked about it. Particularly Mark Kurlansky's talk a couple years back. He authored a book called Cod, which is a great, relatively short read on the species and its history, rich history in the region. So we've had some representation of the species in the lecture series before, but for this lecture, we're going to shift to a slightly different direction. Really what I'd like you to walk away from this lecture understanding is a little bit about the basic biology and ecology of the species, a little bit about its natural history, some basic elements about the fishery or the fisheries that catch this species in the region, and the threats that the species faces and why perhaps it hasn't recovered to the extent that everybody wants it to. We're also going to focus a lot on the research that's going on here at the aquarium, and particularly a project that I'm leading that's addressing this particular species. And there'll be a good lesson in there in how research can aid the management and conservation of a vulnerable species like cod. So hopefully you'll walk away with all these lessons tonight. So to start out with, just a little bit about the sort of evolutionary history, the classification of the species. So cod are part of the family Gattidae, so they're a gaddid species, which is part of the, for those of you that know this type of terminology, part of the order Gattiformes. And the characteristic features for these species, which include cod as well as whiting, pollock, haddock, all obviously very popular, commercially popular, and also in some cases recreationally popular species here in the Gulf of Maine. Each of these species has 3 dorsal fins and 2 anal fins, as well as a barbel on the chin. Barbel is typically used as a tactile organ, so a sensory, touch sensory organ for these fish. But it's also involved in the case of cod as it holds its taste buds, which is very interesting. So they use this quite a bit with their feeding. These species are all found in temperate waters in the northern hemisphere, and they're all carnivorous and some very voracious predators, feeding on smaller fish, crustaceans, and mollusks, depending upon their life stage, how old they are. They're also they're highly prolific with a very high fecundity. For those that don't know what that term means, it's the ability to reproduce, produce offspring. And these species are highly prolific. They produce a lot of eggs, and in theory should produce a lot of offspring. So moving specifically to cod now, Gadus morhua, there are actually 4 species as part of, from this genus, Gadus. Atlantic cod is the only one here in the Atlantic. And the preferred temperature range of the species is very cold to temperate. They're benthopelagic. And what that means is even though they're benthic in where they live, which is the seafloor, they're pelagic in that they live and they hover just above the seafloor. So they're not truly on the seafloor as a flounder might be or a skate. They live in various bottom types, and as we'll learn momentarily, a lot of that depends on the life stage, how old they are. They're also, as I mentioned with the gadids in general, they're voracious predators. And they have a wide range of prey species, including, as you can see pictured here, and I'll use this cursor from time to time, smaller cod. So bigger cod like to eat smaller cod, as well as a wide variety of other dietary species. They are what's known as omnivorous, so they're very non-selective. They eat a lot of different things. But a lot of that, again, depends on how old they are and what their life stage is. Obviously, a juvenile cod is not going to be eating a larger cod or a bigger fish. So speaking of the life stage, so it's an interesting life stage. The early life stages display a very fast growth rate. So when they're small, they grow very quickly. The growth rates depend a lot on where the cod are. So the population here in the Gulf of Maine, the growth rates might be a little bit different than the population for the Icelandic cod population, for example, or some of the other areas that we'll find cod. And I didn't talk about their distribution, but on the previous slide, you can see here their distribution is pretty wide-ranging in the northern hemisphere in the Atlantic, both the western and eastern Atlantic, everywhere from the Icelandic the seas, so Iceland waters, the Baltic Sea, as well as both coasts of Greenland and Labrador. And they actually range as far south as Cape Hatteras here in the United States in the western Atlantic. So shifting back, sorry to digress. So the life stage, anyway, so they grow very quickly to early life stage. Once they get bigger, the growth slows down, and they top out at about 25 years old. Generally, they live to be about 15 to 20 years old. But when they get very, very big, especially the females, their reproductive potential is just immense. As females grow older, they have more and more eggs. So it's not unprecedented for a very large female to have 9 million eggs, up to 9 million eggs. You can see this image by this image right here. That's an example of a very, very large female. So it's pretty devastating to remove a very large female from the population as far as how that is what you're removing as far as reproductive potential. So so anyway, the other aspects I wanted to discuss were just the habitat for these different life stages. When they're very, very young, they're pelagic, which means they drift along with the ocean currents. As they get older and they become more in control of their movement, they reside in eelgrass beds, and then eventually on sandy bottoms, and then as they get really big, in rocky substrates like cobble. So they move and they range depending upon their life stage. So this quote I just wanted to show you, it's fairly ironic. It's from the 1850s. And at that point, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of the species momentarily, but cod were everywhere, and they were easy to find, and the fisheries were thriving. And at that point, people did things to keep themselves busy, like count eggs. I don't know how they found the time to count 9,384,000 eggs, but we did the calculations this morning, and if they worked 12 hours a day, and they counted 1 egg per second, it would take them about 200 days to count all those eggs. No, in actuality, they probably weighed small portions of the eggs and then extrapolated out or expanded that estimate and didn't really count every single egg. But the bottom line, the irony of this quote is that at that time it was far-fetched to believe that cod could be exterminated or greatly reduced based on how prolific they were from a reproductive standpoint. So what's come to fruition now, as I'll mention momentarily, is we've had real sharp declines in our cod populations, and so this was not necessarily prophetic for what would eventually happen. It's very ironic. So the history and the cultural importance of the species is very well known here in the region. Up in Newfoundland, before Cabot came to Newfoundland back in the 15th century, there was already a thriving fishery for cod by the Europeans. Here in Massachusetts, 100 years before the Pilgrims arrived, there was a thriving cod fishery. So the fisheries for these species go back a long way. But back then, the technologies and the means to fish and the practices we use nowadays were not invented yet. So they didn't even have the means to get out there and get the cod numbers or any numbers of any species like we do now. So they still managed to get a ton of fish, as you'll learn momentarily. I'll show you an interesting plot on that. But you were talking about a very ancestral fishery. But it was a driving fishery, namely because cod, they didn't have refrigeration back then. So cod would stay very, very well when they were salted. And they still remain very, very tasty when they were salted for long periods of time. So that's the main reason that in their abundance, they became such a popular species in fishery. So the the dedication to cod and the importance economically and culturally has continued to this day. For those of you that live in the city of Boston or the surrounding areas or New England in general, you see signs of this all the time, from the image on the top left at Legal Seafoods to this so-called sacred cod on the bottom left, which has hung in the State House for, I think, hundreds of years, to statues and just to all the puns, including the really sort of lame title of my talk tonight. Everybody likes to use the cod pun for different things. So cod are a big, big species, and everybody likes to talk about them. And everybody also likes to eat them. And, well, not everybody, but people that like seafood generally like to eat cod. They've become a seafood staple here in the region. And because of that demand and the fact that people do like to eat them, it's driven a very thriving historical, fishery here, even in recent years, to go beyond just the longer historical events that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So in recent years, there's been a thriving commercial fishery as well as a recreational fishery that's been also extremely prolific. And I'll get to that. So because of the fact that there's been so much fishing effort, the populations for the species have declined. You're looking here at the population of the spawning stock biomass, which basically means the population of the animals that are old enough, mature enough to reproduce. You're looking at the spawning stock biomass on Georges Bank. We have two different stocks here in New England. We have the Georges Bank cod stock, and we have the Gulf of Maine cod stock. So this is the Georges Bank cod stock, and you can see over the last 30 years, the numbers have declined fairly drastically. And that has namely due to fishing activities. In addition, if you look at the total Gulf of Maine cod catch over the last 30 or so years, you see a decline as well. Now, not as sharp or precipitous a decline as you saw on the previous slide. This is actually, this represents the total catch of the animals. Now, in theory, when you get a very low amount of catch, it could be because there's not as many to catch, but it also could be that there's less fishing effort. And indeed, in recent years, there's been a lot of management policy to curtail or reduce the amount of fishing effort, particularly commercially. So you're seeing less and less cod being caught in general. But just to give you a historical baseline, if you look at that last 30-year snippet of time and you compare it to back in the 1860s, that is the total amount of catch that they got back then, based on estimated catch records that were put together in a study that was published in 2009 by Alexander et al. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there wasn't the sophisticated technology driving the fishery back then. They couldn't get as many fish as quickly with as little effort as they can now using commercial fishing vessels and other means that we have now. So it's all the more impressive that you can just see how many cod were being caught back then and how few there are now. And this just gives you sort of an idea that of the difference, almost a four-fold or 4 times the amount of cod that were historically caught are being caught today. Generally, people assume that the primary reason the cod stocks or populations have declined as drastically as they have is because of the pressures exerted by the commercial fishing industry. And it's true, while the commercial fishing industry plays a big, big role, in actuality, recreational fishing or angling for cod is also a very, very big practice. And for those of you that don't know what angling means, that haven't not heard that term, it simply means any fish that's caught and not sold. So if you're going out to fish for recreation, whether it be to bring back fish to eat for dinner or just for sport, and you're not selling that fish for market, you are recreationally angling or recreationally fishing. So to give you a comparison, if you look at this plot, in black, this represents the recreational catch, and that means all of the cod, and this is in the Gulf of Maine, all of the cod that are caught and either kept or thrown back by recreational fishers historically over time. And that is compared to the gray, which is the commercial catch. So again, all the fish that are kept, which are called landings, and all the fish that are thrown back for various reasons. And we'll get to why these fish are thrown back momentarily, but most of it has to do with regulations, policies that are imposed. So if you look, about 20 to 31% in the last 10 years of the total catch in the Gulf of Maine has been composed of the recreational fishery. That's not a trivial amount. So the recreational fishery contributes quite a bit to the total cod catch. The recreational fishery itself is known as a meat fishery. For those of you that don't know what that means, people generally go out to catch cod because they want to eat them. So they target larger cod. And there are indeed possession limits. We'll talk about those specifically in a couple minutes. And minimum size restrictions. So you can only keep a certain number per day, and they have to be of a certain size, basically. And there are also closed seasons where people cannot possess cod. They might be able to catch them, but they have to then discard them. So that's the basis of the recreational fishery here in the Gulf of Maine. So that begs the question, as we talked about a few slides ago, what is the fate of the discarded cod? So the animals that are thrown back. We've already learned that cod are caught at a high rate. In the recreational fishery, they are sought after because of the larger fish that yield the most meat, because that's the basis of the fishery. But there are also those fish that have to be thrown back. And that's a very important factor to understand. So to understand the fate of the animals that are thrown back, you first have to understand that there are detrimental aspects to fishing capture and the animals that are handled. I'm an avid fisherman my whole life, and I know many of you in the room are. And I think everybody here knows that depending upon the type of capture experience that the fish goes through, the type of fishing gear, as well as the fish itself, which species are we talking about, how old it is, and many, many other factors, that determines how physically injured the fish will become, or the physical injuries the fish will sustain, how physiologically stressed the fish will become during the capture process, and essentially what it will experience. And those detrimental aspects of the capture process, as you can see on this image here, or this slide here, and there are various things that can happen. You can have physical injuries. You can have an animal that's thrown back into the ocean and be preyed upon by a larger species. You can have, and that includes seabirds here, as you can see in this shot. And then, if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but you also have fish that come up very decompressed. For those of you that don't know, when you have a deep sea fish species, it's very accustomed, it's conditioned to a certain pressure. And that pressure at depth, when you bring the fish up very rapidly, is reduced. And when you reduce that pressure, all of the gas that's in, some of these fish have gas bladders that help them stay buoyant in the water. And all the gas that's in these gas bladders will expand and force other organs to protrude out of the animal. So you see in this case the eversion of the eyes. And generally this stems from a distended swim bladder or gas bladder that these fish have internally. So that can be one damaging result from being captured. And then I'll talk about this here on this slide. You end up with either acute or delayed mortality. So when the animals either die immediately or they die when they're thrown back into the ocean. Acute mortality occurs when the animal, it's caught either before, it dies either before it's brought up on board or it dies in the short aftermath while it's on deck. The delayed mortality occurs when you have an animal it can either be in seemingly great shape when you throw it back, or it might be injured or compromised in some way. But either way, you don't really know what happens to it because you throw it back, and once it's back in the ocean, it dies. So those are the two contributors to what we call discard mortality. And those are very important to understand because, again, we always think that when we throw a fish back, it's going to be okay. But that is predicated on the ultimate survival of the animal, and it may not survive. So it's not just the fish that are being kept for the fishery, or in that particular case, that drives the total mortality in the fishery. But it's also the animals that die once they're thrown back. So this is a good schematic that describes it. So first you catch the fish, and you have a bunch of fish on deck of your boat, whether it be through recreational hook and line capture or some commercial fishing gear. Some of those fish are landed, which means they're kept. Some of those fish are thrown back. Those that are landed contribute to the total mortality from that fishery. Those that are thrown back can either be thrown back dead or they can be thrown back alive. And those that are thrown back alive may either survive in the long run or die in the long run. And ultimately, these three in the red, those that die in the long run, those that are discarded dead, and those that are landed, contribute to the total fishing mortality. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's important to understand when you're talking about discards. Now, if we talk about the recreational fishery here in the Gulf of Maine, and we look at the discards in this fishery, to what extent do we discard cod and throw them back? Over the last decade or so, 18 to 22% of the overall cod catch by weight, and that's important to remember, by weight, has been discarded. 18 to 22%, about a fifth of the total catch. And that's not trivial. That's not trivial at all. That's actually a significant amount of the catch. Now, the reason that it's only 18 to 22% is because most people fish for larger cod. So they keep those cod and they throw back the small guys, and we'll get to that. And indeed, when you look at, this is a different plot, when you look at the number of cod that are discarded, the number, not the weight, but the number, you see that there's a much larger percentage of the total catch that is discarded than kept, retained, or landed. More than 2 times the number of fish discarded, more than 2 times the number of fish that are landed are discarded. So you have a high discard rate, and the reason is going back to what I mentioned a few slides ago about the size limits that are imposed. There are these possession and bag limits, and in the case of the Gulf of Maine cod fishery, recreational anglers are allowed to keep 9 fish per person per day. And that hasn't changed over the last handful of years. But there's also a minimum size retention. And the basis of the minimum size retention is you don't want to allow the really small cod to be removed and kept by the fishermen until they've had a chance to reproduce. So in this case, up until a couple years ago, we had a 24-inch size limit on cod. You had to throw every cod back that was less than 24 inches. But how does discard mortality play a role in all this? And this is where it gets kind of interesting. So there's a discard mortality assumption. And bear in mind, we have no idea, up until the study that I'm about to talk to you guys about, we had no idea how many of the cod that were being thrown back were dying. We had no idea. We knew a little bit about other fisheries, other gear types for cod, but we didn't know about the recreational fishery. So because we didn't know, fisheries managers assumed that 100%, they used a very conservative figure, they assumed 100% of the cod that were thrown back by law were dying. 100%. So on that basis, obviously you'd want to reduce the number of discards. You don't want to throw back a lot of cod if they're dying anyway. So how can you reduce the number of discards? Well, you can reduce the size limit. And that's a little bit counterintuitive to some people. But if you reduce the size limit and you make that size cutoff less stringent, so no longer is it 24 inches, but it's 19, and you still have this 9 fish per day bag limit, it's going to take the average fisherman much less catch to get to their bag limit. They're not going to be throwing back as many fish because that size cutoff is lower, if that makes sense. So by lowering the size limit, they're actually reducing the number of discards and allowing people to get their bag limit every day with fewer total fish caught. Now, after taking some criticism for that, what was described as an overly inflated assumption of discard mortality, NIMS convened a meeting, or the National Marine Fisheries Service convened a meeting, bringing all different parties together to try to come up with a more accurate estimate. Again, no study had been conducted, so we didn't know how many of these fish were dying. But the overall agreement between the fishing community, research community, fisheries managers was that a number more around the 30% mark would be more accurate for this fishery. The claim was that cod caught by hook and line are not enduring that much stress or injury. And that in reality, you're going to have some animals that die, but the vast majority, 70% in this case, would survive. So because of that, you had this change in opinion to, obviously you'd want to increase the number of discards at that point, because you want to allow the fish to get back into the, if they're surviving at a high rate, you want to allow them to get back into their population to reproduce and fuel growth of that population. So in response to that, the limit was changed again this past year, just in 2014, back up to 21 inches where it stands right now. And the bag limit remains the same at 9 per day. But this is a great example of how information or research data on discard mortality can bear a huge influence on the policies and regulations that are going on in fisheries, and in this case, the cod fishery. That being said, the 30% clip is still a complete estimate. It's based on various opinions and expert opinions for that matter, but it's still an estimate and it still needed to be validated. So that led to our thinking that we should conduct a study on the true discard mortality of cod in the recreational fishery. So when they're caught and released, how many of them are dying? So we submitted a grant to the National Marine Fisheries Service, and we're fortunate enough to get funding to conduct this study here at the New England Aquarium in conjunction with the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries and our colleagues at the University of New England to join together and mount a study to really answer this question as it requires. So when you try to estimate how many fish die when they're thrown back, that's not an easy proposition for reasons you can understand. You can't easily track these fish when they go back into the ocean. So how do you really know if they live or die? Research in the past, including that on cod, not in the recreational fishery, but again in other fisheries, has relied on different methods to do this. And generally, as in the case with the onboard aquaria and sea pens, this relies on enclosing the animals for the first few days after they've been caught. So instead of throwing them back into the ocean, you keep them contained, and then you monitor how many of them live or die. Now there are a few problems with these methods. The problems are that, and I've used these methods, so I'm not criticizing that research at all. It's actually very valuable because you can get very high sample sizes using these methods. But by enclosing them, you're stressing them out more. So you may be inflating the mortality rate so that it's biased a little bit, and it's higher than it would be in reality if they were thrown back. But at the same time, by keeping them in these enclosures, you're shielding these animals from predation. So if they were thrown back into the ocean, they might be picked off by seabirds or other fish, predators. So by shielding them, you're bringing the mortality, you're biasing that mortality rate lower. So these methods, although they can yield very useful results, are imperfect. As well as the method of mark and recapture, which is known as conventional tagging. And there have been a lot of conventional tagging programs that maybe even people in this room have been part of in the Gulf of Maine. And simply what that requires is tagging these animals manually with some sort of a very, very small tag. You can see here these T-bar tags right here on this cod. And they're usually marked with a telephone contact number of some sort and potentially notification that they're going to reward any effort to call back this particular cod in the case of a research program, they might offer some money to somebody that takes the time, picks up the phone, and says, we caught one of your cod that was tagged. And usually there's a tag number on that tag, and so you can report that tag and where you caught the fish and any other information that the researchers need. This has been used in the past to try to determine mortality. But as you can probably guess, it's very, very difficult to come up with good sample sizes because the odds of recapturing the same fish are fairly low, and the odds of the people taking the time to call you once they've recaptured the fish are also low. So generally, if you get like a 5% return on your tags, that's a huge return. And so that's still a very, very low rate of return, and it prevents the ability to really answer the mortality question adequately. So these methods have been used in the past, including some work that we've conducted here at the aquarium, where we've conducted studies principally looking at longline fishing capture. For those of you that don't know what longline is all about, you can see it in this illustration in the top left. For those of you that saw the movie The Perfect Storm, swordfish and tuna fisheries are generally based on longline fishing. It's when you line a string of hooks between two endpoints on either terminal end of either side of the string of hooks, and you let them, what's known as soak, in the water for long periods of time, and then you go back and check them and you pull the animals up. And the hooks can either be on the bottom, as in the case here in this illustration, or they can be pelagic or in the water column. So we focused a lot on looking at cod in this fishery because it's caught commercially quite a bit in the longline fishery. And we learned some valuable lessons through our work in the past with cod here at the aquarium, namely that season can play a big role in whether the cod live or die. So if you throw cod back during the summer, as you might imagine, it's very, very warm. On deck of your fishing boat, it's very, very warm. The water at the surface of the ocean is very, very warm. And remember, these cod live on the bottom where it's cold all year round. It may get a little bit warmer during the summer, but it generally stays cold. So if you bring them up through a very warm surface water and then onto the deck of the boat in very warm air temperature, you're going to have what's known as a thermal stress or a temperature stress that's put on these animals, and that can be lethal, and that can contribute to the mortality of these animals. We also learned from these, as I mentioned, that the cage method or the enclosure method for looking at discard mortality is flawed, and I won't get back into that. I just mentioned that in the previous slide. And then we also learned that the gear type itself, so what the type of fishing that you're doing. the type of commercial fishing gear, or in this case, we're talking about recreational fishing gear, the type of gear that you're using can bear a huge influence on whether the animal lives or dies. So that led us to come up with a couple of broad objectives for our present research. One being that we needed to examine the injury level and the condition, the energy, vigor, and the total discard mortality of cod caught in the recreational fishery in the Gulf of Maine. While we were doing that, and that would play a very vital role, as I've described, in the management process to understand how many of the animals are truly dying and what their condition is, at the same time, we want to understand if there are any fatalities, what is killing these animals? What are the detrimental factors in the fishery that are leading to the highest mortality rates? If we understand that, then we can move on to the second objective, which is to establish best catch and release guidelines to offer the highest probability that the cod we throw back survive. I think everybody that fishes for recreation, including people that fish for cod commercially as well, want the cod that they throw back to live. The more cod that live, the more it's going to promote or support a recovered or a stable fishery. And everybody wants to keep fishing. If you love to fish or you do it for a living, you want that to continue. So to establish best practices in the recreational fishery, that's very, very important, because we have the control when we're out fishing, 2 or 3 of us, or on a larger party boat. We have the ability individually to make changes in our behavior or our gear that might enhance the survival of these animals. So that was a big goal as part of this project, to really understand what we can do individually to help them. So we wanted to best reflect what's going on in the recreational fishery. So in advance of this study, we went and surveyed recreational anglers all over the place to determine which practices are normally used to catch cod. And what we discovered is that about the same amount of people in general use jigs as they do bait with hooks, hook and line. So we had these sort of comparable modes of capture for cod, so we wanted to reflect that in our study. And we also wanted to reflect all the other factors that might vary during the course of, while people go out and fish for recreation. There are lots of factors that can change on a daily basis, or boat to boat, person to person. So we wanted to try to reflect all these things to come up with the most accurate reflection of the fishery. Now, then the question comes up, how did we actually evaluate discard mortality? So if the methods I talked to you about earlier are flawed to varying degrees, we needed to come up with a better strategy. The use of telemetry, or tracking of animals using sophisticated electronic tags, has become very prevalent in recent years with fish. For a long time, people have been using these electronic tags with birds and other terrestrial animals to track them and understand their movement, migratory patterns, where they live, how they move around by season, things of that nature, using these sophisticated tags. And it's become more widely used with fish for the same reasons, to understand habitat use and movement. But until recently, nobody had really used these tags to try to understand the mortality rates of these fish when they're thrown back. We figured that with small cod, and again, small cod are the ones that are thrown back most commonly, we figured with small cod, they would not be mounting very, very large-scale movements. And we thought that they'd stay in a fairly confined coverage area. And that made us think that there was one particular strategy that we should use using this tracking technology. And this is known as passive acoustic telemetry. So I'll try to explain this in as simplistic terms as I can. Acoustic telemetry in general is based on tagging these fish with a device that emits an acoustic signal, or a sound signal. That sound signal is then picked up by a receiver. Now, when we talk about passive acoustic telemetry, this is an example of what we do. We actually have the receiver stationary in one position, and we rely upon the fish itself to swim within the confines of the range of that receiver. It transmits information to that receiver. The receiver stores that information, and then we can go back and pick up the receiver later. So the receiver itself is passive, and that's why it's called passive telemetry. Active telemetry, which we didn't use, is when you tag the fish and then you actually follow it actively with a boat using a hydrophone or a comparable device to pick up signals from your fish. And that works when you have a sort of a relatively sluggish species that you can see, you might be able to track over a number of hours. With cod here in the Gulf of Maine, once they're gone, they're gone. You're not going to see them. So we felt like our best bet was to put out a lot of these receivers staggered around an area where we knew we'd be able to catch these small cod, tag these cod with acoustic transmitters, and then hope that they would stay within the coverage range of that acoustic, what's known as an acoustic array. And then over time, we'd be able to tell, okay, are they moving? Are they alive? Or are they dead? And as I'll get to, we have certain criteria for how we determine that. So indeed, we went out and we deployed these receivers. This is a picture of what a receiver looks like. This is an image of what the tag looks like. And we externally tag these cod, generally with these types of electronic tags, to reduce the likelihood that you lose them, that they become detached from the animal. They're surgically implanted. We didn't want to do that because we didn't want to perform surgery on these fish that we were trying to evaluate for mortality. We didn't want to unnecessarily increase the amount of stress that was imposed on these animals. So we tagged them quickly and on the outside of their bodies. And we actually conducted a laboratory study in advance of this study to determine the best place to attach these tags that would yield the lowest probability that we would lose them when the cod were back at liberty, when they were back swimming around in their normal environment. So we tagged the animals with these acoustic tags. We had these receivers. We put out over 30 receivers, and you can see the array here. This coverage area is about 35 square kilometers on southern Jeffreys Ledge, for those of you that are familiar with that area, northeast of Gloucester. And that's about 35 square kilometers, about 21, 22 miles. So it's a fairly large coverage area. And they're not necessarily overlapping in the coverage areas, these receivers and their coverage areas, but they're very, very close. So as long as the cod stay in this area, we have record over time of how they're moving. Does that make sense? So in this next slide, I'm going to show you the power of this type of data. So you can see through this animation, this is not our study, but this was another study that was conducted by the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, so our colleagues on this study. This was one of their past studies. And this is fascinating data where you're looking at male and female cod on the spawning grounds in areas, in a closed area off Gloucester. And right around the same time every year in the spring, cod perform these very elaborate spawning aggregation behaviors, generally within like a 1 to 2 month window. And what happens is, and I'm not going to get into the details of this study, it's very interesting, but the females congregate during the day in these very, very small aggregations or small packs. And the males also aggregate, but they move more widely. And then at night, the males seek out territories. And the females deposit eggs, and the males deposit sperm. And these egg masses are then fertilized. And that leads to the next stage, the larvae of these animals that then go through the life stage that I described to you earlier on. So anyway, what I really want you to get out of this slide is that by taking all the data collectively, and this is a 24-hour cycle that you're looking at that is repeating again and again and again. But by taking all the data, the acoustic telemetry data collectively, you can actually piece together this type of movement, this dynamic movement that these animals are portraying here. So that is very powerful. And even though you're actually relying on one receiver at a time, you can take all those receivers together and you have a massive amount of data. Of course, that assumes that, again, that the cod stay within the coverage area. If they take off, you have no record, and you're out $600 because that's how much these tags cost. They're not cheap. So unlike the little tags that people throw in animals or cod by the thousands, the mark recapture tags that I talked to you about earlier, these are far more expensive. So we have this horizontal movement that we're able to detect with these tags. Movement around, you're looking, obviously, this is not three-dimensional, you're looking down on this. So you're looking at horizontal movement. We needed to develop criteria for estimating whether these fish lived or died. We threw them back and we tagged them. So we used two criteria. We used horizontal movement, and you can see here in this living cod, I don't know if you can make it out. Yeah, you can. The red dot is where these are all receivers. All these dots are receivers. And the red dot is where the cod was originally tagged. And then all the other black dots in this grid represent where this particular cod moved after it was tagged and released. So you could see it was pretty active. And the time scale here, you're talking about months. So this is a pretty broad time period. Now, at the same time, our tags were special in that they were equipped with the ability to determine vertical movement as well. So the depth changes. So while these cod were moving side to side, we could also tell with these tags whether they were moving up and down. Now, why is this important? Well, if you look at this dead cod, you see that you tag it here on the red mark, and it moved to one receiver and then just stayed there for a long period of time. Now, we would initially think, okay, it probably died, but there are a couple other scenarios there that are possible. Number one, what's to say that that cod isn't just sitting there within the coverage of that receiver for a long period of time and not moving? It might just be very, very lazy and just hanging out in one spot. The less likely possibility is that the tag actually came off the cod. And that's something that we have to deal with in these types of studies. By conducting the lab study that I mentioned in advance, we try to reduce the probability that the tags will come off by developing a method we think will be sound. But that's possible, but less likely. So anyway, it's possible this cod is not dead, but just hanging out within the coverage of one receiver. So that's when our second criterion comes into play, and that's this vertical depth, the ability to look at vertical depth. Now, if this cod was hanging out in one area, we would still see this very active profile that you see on the top plot. And again, this is the up and down in the water column, up and down. But as you can see here, we're flatlining. So this particular cod not only was not moving horizontally, it was also not moving vertically, up and down. So we concluded on this one case study that this particular animal has died. And that's how we are able to use these data to determine live versus dead. So once we had these criteria established, we went out and we started to fish. And we actually conducted the study, which was the fun part. And we fished all summer long, and we fished within the confines of the array where these receivers are deployed. Because obviously you want to release the fish within your coverage area where you can detect them. So we fished and we used anglers of varying experience levels. That's the true predicament in the real world. There are people that have been fishing for years and are experts and know exactly what they're doing. And there are people that have never fished a day in their life that go out and fish. So we wanted to reflect both of those scenarios. So we had people that had never fished, and then we had people that were, absolute experts and knew exactly what they were doing. And we, of course, fished all summer, so we reflected many, many changing conditions. Very, very hot days, relatively cooler days, high winds, low winds. We messed around with factors like how long the cod sat on deck before they were thrown back. And that's something that really happens. Even if you're going to throw a fish back that you catch, sometimes you take a picture of it before you throw it back. We understood the fact that many of these animals would incur different injury levels based on the hooking injury or the jigging injury, and we'll get to that. So we factored all of this took all of this into account. So once we started catching the cod, then we had to start tagging them. And we were tagging them with our acoustic tags, and again, we used a process that was as rapid as possible to do that. At the same time, we got measurements on the animals, how the total size of the animals. We looked at their behavior and how quickly they swam back down when we threw them back. We looked at their visual appearance, and that's how we determined their injury level. So we had this condition scoring system that we used. So for every cod that came up, we looked at their energy levels and their injury levels, and we had this rank score based on a lot of previous studies that both we had done and others had done. And you can see here there's a range. You have cod that were in fairly good condition, or as good a condition as you're going to get when they're caught. And then you started to decline with minor injury here in the 2 category, to degrade it even more with more severe injury, to an animal that was really badly damaged injury-wise here in the category 4, where we assumed it was likely to die. So we had these condition scores, and we were hoping to couple those condition scores with the animals that we acoustically tagged to try to make our study more powerful. So some of our preliminary results. We observed 637 total fish across the course of the summer that we were conducting the study. And I didn't mention earlier, but there was a mix of size classes here. While we were looking at the sublegal individuals, those that were below the legal threshold, we also wanted to catch some cod and tag some cod that were a little bit bigger, because you never know when these size limits are going to change. So we wanted to kind of get those just over that size threshold and under that size threshold to get a range to see if the size of the animal had any influence on whether it lived or died. We did see some emigration, meaning some of these cod, once they were tagged, left our coverage area. But within the 15-day window, which we feel is the most important window, if these cod are going to die, most of them are going to die from acute stress and injury in those first 2 weeks. We found this is preliminary, but we found a 21% mortality rate. Fairly close to the 30% that was estimated through these convening exercises to try to come up with estimates that I mentioned earlier, and certainly much less than the 100% that was previously assumed. So the bottom line is almost 80%, based on our preliminary data, 80% of the cod that are being thrown back are surviving. But there were some clear influences on which fish were dying. So first off, and I didn't mention this earlier, but the jigs that are used in the recreational fishery, these 14 or 16 ounce Norwegian jigs, are fairly big when you consider this very, very small cod that they sometimes catch. Of course, when you go out, you want to catch big cod. So these things are appropriate for big cod. But today we put together this really nice cardboard cutout. This is my cod. I didn't want to bring a real cod here. That would have been a little messy. But this is the size scale that you would, around the 18, 19 inch mark. So this is right around the threshold. Right now, if you caught a cod this big with a 21 inch cutoff, you'd have to throw this cod back. So you can just see the size of the jig compared to the cod. And with that in mind, it's not surprising that you can do a significant amount of damage with these jigs. And indeed, if you look at these pie charts here, roughly with the jig, only 50% of the animals that were thrown back were in the best condition according to our score, whereas 70% of the animals we threw back that were caught by hook and line on bait had this very, very high condition score, meaning that they were in the best of shape. So we had a higher rate of injury and more severe injury in the jig-caught fish. And I showed one image earlier in the presentation that was a good representation of that. One reason that happens quite a bit, particularly with anglers that are not as experienced, is that these jigs foul hook the animals, meaning they don't hook them in the mouth, but they hook them in other parts of the body. And you can see that in the image I'm showing right here. And that can, especially in a small cod, can cause extreme damage. So you end up with a high injury level. But at the same time, we saw a difference in size, where the smallest cod, and this makes sense according to the same reasons I just mentioned, the smallest cod were incurring the highest rate of injury and the most severe injuries. So we still have a lot of analyses to conduct, but it looks early on like these two big factors may play a role, or play a large role. So as I mentioned before, some of the early conclusions, as I mentioned before, the 30% assumption is in line with reality. We need more to complete our analyses. We feel there are other factors that are going to emerge once we continue to analyze these data. As I said earlier, this acoustic data, there's just massive amounts of data. So it takes a very, very long time to filter it all and make sense out of it. So we're still working on data that we collected last summer right now. And then some of these conclusions, based on the previous pie charts, that these cod are 3 times more likely to be in a degraded condition, in worse condition, when they're caught by jig, and 2 times more likely to be in that poor condition when they're less than 19 inches. So size does seem to bear some influence. Now, this might have some bearing on policy, and as well as in the best practices guidelines that I mentioned to you earlier. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But our study methods in general instilled confidence that we could use this type of electronic tracking technology to answer this question in this type of a species. And that bodes well, because there are other species that need to be addressed in a similar fashion right here in our local waters. So we have plans to hopefully expand this work, looking ahead, and conduct work on other species and look at other factors. Now, when we complete the analysis, as I mentioned, we want to focus on outreach efforts. And the biggest outreach is, again, the development of these best practice guidelines to increase the chances that the cod survive. Now, if our data continue, if our analysis confirms that the jig factor is a big one, then it would suggest the notion that people might want to shift their strategy away from jig, even though many people prefer it. They prefer fishing with jigs. There may be a precedent to try to change that approach a little bit, or at least to consider it. And there may even be policies eventually enacted in that interest. As well as the size cutoffs as well. That might influence the size limits that the managers enact. So there could be major aspects of the outreach that are important and have influence, so we need to really understand those. And then we need to get those best practices disseminated to the appropriate parties, and we have plans to do that. Through our partners with the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, we already have access to many of the people, probably some people here in this room, that fish for recreation. So we're hoping to get this information to the proper policymakers as well as the fishers that can make the most difference. I wanted to mention barotraumas really quickly. It's not a huge focus of this talk, namely because, well, let me take a step back. So barotraumas, for those of you that don't know, I talked about them a little bit earlier, but cod, as well as some of their close relatives, have these gas bladders that I talked about. And these gas bladders will expand when the animals come up from depth. So that can cause serious injury. It's not as much of an issue with cod because the worst barotraumas are with the biggest cod, and those are usually the ones that are kept. But in other species like cusk that you see here, when they come up, they're generally very, very decompressed. Their gas bladders might rupture. If not, they're distended heavily, and you have all these protruding organs. In this case, you have the stomach and the esophagus protruding out of the mouth, which is not a pretty sight. And even in this case, gas bubbles building up along the tissue, the outer tissue under the skin. So barotraumas are a big issue. We hope to look into this a little bit more because there actually are intervention methods that are being used around the world, that when these animals come up in this type of condition, there are ways to increase the chances that they actually survive. If you were to throw them back as is, generally they're like balloons. They're just going to float on the surface, and they're going to either die from stress or suffocation, or they're going to be picked off by a predator. But there are devices now that actually can usher these fish back down to the pressures they're accustomed to on the seafloor and potentially increase their chances of survival. There are also strategies that are being used where you can actually pierce a particular organ on the fish and vent that gas so that they deflate, essentially, and then they might be able to get down on their own. But this is an issue here in the Gulf of Maine that's received very, very little attention. But if you fish for recreation, you've probably seen fish, including cod, come up in that type of condition. And if we have time in a minute, I'll show you an image or two. But with that being said, that was a mouthful. I covered that study. I could have probably spoken for an hour on any one of these slides. So it was a little bit all over the place, and I apologize for that. We do have about, when I finish momentarily, we're going to have some time for questions. So hopefully I can clarify anything that might have come across as confusing. But with that said, I'd like to acknowledge some of the people that have helped in this project. And this is a really good time to mention that as a research biologist, the biggest strength you can have is to understand things well, not only things that you can do well, but things that you can't do well, and that areas that you don't have expertise. And then you want to team up strategically with people that have expertise in those areas. And this was a great example of that. Working with the Mass Division of Marine Fisheries, particularly Bill Hoffman and Micah Dean, as well as our graduate students on the project, Connor Capizano and Doug Zemeckis. Working with these folks and their expertise was just invaluable, immeasurable. All of their work and all the time that they've spent in the Gulf of Maine using acoustic telemetry and working with cod paid huge dividends in this project. So I'd like to credit them extensively, as well as many other people that helped in our field operations, the design of our study, as well as a lot of the administration and analysis of our data, particularly Emily Jones, my partner in crime, who's here tonight, who's a scientist in my lab, who's done a lot of work behind the scenes to help even with presentations like this tonight. So I'd like to credit her. And then finally, I'd like to take a minute to dedicate this talk in general to my former intern and friend here at the aquarium, Rachel Morrison, who tragically passed away while as a graduate student at Scripps on the West Coast in a tragic accident at the end of March. And we're all very devastated by this. And not only do I want to dedicate this talk to Rachel because it's worth dedicating to her and her legacy at the aquarium and everything that she did to help us as an intern here, but there's also a thematic connection. Rachel played a pivotal role in some of the cod stress and survival work that preceded the study that I talked to you guys about tonight. So she did some work as an intern for me for a year, and that ended up being published. One of the papers that I showed you a cover sheet earlier on of a publication that came out from our work, a scientific publication, and that was co-authored by Rachel, and she played a big part in that. So she was a friend to the aquarium and a huge player in a lot of our research, and we'll miss her very much. So I wanted to dedicate this talk to her. And on that note, I'd like to open it up for questions. We have hopefully about 10 minutes or so, a little bit more, to take Q&A and go from there. That's a really good question. So the question is, the 19 to 21 inch difference in the size cutoff, does that really lead to an appreciable difference in the lifespan of that animal? The answer is I don't know the exact answer. It's the 2 years at that growth rate, at that size, they're still growing fairly rapidly. Cod becomes sexually mature at about 15 inches, 2 to 4 years old here in the Gulf of Maine. It varies depending upon where the location is. But in theory, those 2 years, that's 2 spawning seasons. So, or 2 inches, excuse me, what am I talking about? 2 inches. So 2 inches probably, I don't know, what would you say? Probably a couple years, probably 2 or 3 years, and, or maybe even less. So you're talking about at least 1 spawning season, and that's valuable, ultimately. And you're also talking about the cumulative effect, not just one animal, but when you have many, 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 many that are being discarded, and that size difference, as minute as it might seem, probably leads to quite a difference. Yeah, that's a great question. The question is there any interest or effort to include, and I'm assuming you mean the commercial fishing industry, the commercial fishing industry in our research efforts. And I wish we had a commercial fisher here tonight to address it from their vantage point. I can tell you from my vantage point. So although this particular fishery is a recreational fishery, there is a huge involvement for the commercial fishery in New England involved in cooperative research. And we've been involved in many studies now working alongside commercial fishermen who, I can't even tell you the expertise that they add to these projects, because they've been fishing, many of them, for many, many, many years, many generations in some cases of fishermen. So we conduct a lot of work cooperatively, and there's many, many efforts to involve commercial fishermen in research now. There are cooperative fishing programs, and there are even grant programs that are dedicated exclusively to mixing researchers and fishermen together. So while we need more of it, absolutely, and sometimes because there's not so much of it, it actually breeds some problems because you get jealousy. Some fishermen are very accustomed and know how to get involved in these projects and are very active in the research community, while others may not be so much. So I think there's a little bit of, sometimes a little bit, that breeds a little bit of contempt. But overall, there's a big push for it, and we're seeing more and more of it, and that's a positive thing. But I think your point is very well taken. And there are other ways to compensate these fishermen in those ways, and that's become more and more the case as quotas have become more strict and fishing regulations more stringent. We do have, I'm sure we might even have people here tonight that have been involved in tagging programs. There's actually quite a big recreational cod tagging program. There have been several of them over the years, and I've had lectures that I've given here where I've had people come up to me after and said, yeah, we've been tagging cod and other fish for years. One of the commercial fishing captains, who's very well known in the region, Tim Tower, who owns a party boat and has a blog and is very, very active in these circles, has been conducting his own research for years, looking at not only tagging these animals, but looking at their sizes every year, recording all these data, total citizen science. He's not trying to publish this or become a research scientist. He's earning a living on the water with his boat. But he's doing that science, and all that science matters. It's really important in the overall scheme of things. So your point's very well taken, and I think there's more of a push to doing it. So there is not a maximum limit here. The question was, because the cod are so reproductively prolific, when they get huge, would it make sense not only to have a minimum size cutoff, but actually when they reach a certain size threshold, prohibit them from being kept? In other words, if they get really huge, you got to throw them back. The answer is, in some of the cod fisheries around in the northern hemisphere, in the North Atlantic, some of those fisheries do have maximum size cutoffs. We don't here at present, and I could not tell you why, but it makes sense. It certainly makes sense. I can tell you that when big females are removed from the population, it's generally deemed as fairly tragic. And I think the spawning grounds here in the Gulf of Maine that are closed at certain times of the year to commercial and recreational fishing are sacred, and that I think every fisherman, recreational or commercial, do not want people fishing in those spawning grounds during that time of year when you could pick up many of these really big females at one time with one quick effort. So,
is that in general for all fish? The bigger they get,
for many, many fish. For those that are egg-bearing in that way, yes. Yes, it's true for many fish, and it's certainly true for other gadids that I characterized earlier for you. So the haddock and the pollock and the cod. Yeah, so unfortunately I'm presenting this to you at a point where we're right in the middle of this analysis, All these data are very preliminary. We will have full resolution on all of that. And in fact, because we only acoustically tagged 136 fish, and we're only seeing roughly a 20% mortality, you're going to have a fairly low number of total mortality events in the 25 to 30 something range of total fish that died. So you can look at those individuals as case studies, and you can see whether there's any correlation. I can tell you right now that yes, the injury level, because jig led to the highest rate of injury, and because we saw this connection between between jig and the highest mortality, there is a definite correlation between the injury status at the time that you release the animal and whether they live or die. And the distribution, the data is there. I didn't pull it up for this talk, but I can tell you from, do you recall, Emily, that I think, interestingly, there was a spread of when these fish died. A bunch of them died in the first 6-7 days, but I was surprised. Some of them lived a little bit longer and then died, and that makes me a little more nervous about those data that suggest that they might have lost the tag. Because you would expect that from the acute injury and physiological stress that most of these fish would die in that first week. We were seeing more of a spread, but stay tuned. If I come back and present again, I'll give you a little more detail. Actually, the results from this study are going to be widely available, not only through the Mass Division of Marine Fisheries and their normal commercial fishery distributions, but also their website, and we hope to publish all this data as well. That's a great question. The question is the eternal attachment of these tags influencing the behavior or potentially even the data in our study? So I mentioned briefly, but I didn't get into detail, that we conducted a laboratory study in advance of our study. So while we were conducting this study, we took cod in a mix of size classes, and we put these tags on them in different configurations. And we looked at their behavior. First of all, we looked at whether they lived or died. And then we looked at their behavior and whether they were able to swim freely, so whether their hydrodynamics were affected by having these tags hanging off of them. And then we also looked at whether they lost these tags over time. And that was a key factor, as I mentioned, related to the acoustic telemetry. We came up with what we thought, based on all of our data in advance, and based on many other studies that have been conducted using external attachment, including studies by members of my research team here. We came up with what we thought was the best method. Now, I have one of these tags. If you're interested, you can come up after and I can show you what an acoustic tag looks like. It's small, but in relation to the size of the fish, get jigged here. In relation to the size of the fish, it can be pretty large, as you saw in some of those images. So in theory, yes, it could exert some influence on them, but we caught codfish that were just about 15, 16 inches or bigger. And on those fish, we didn't see any evidence from our laboratory experiments that there was any real effect over time. Great question. And we were grappling with this earlier because on one of the slides we showed, what she's asking is, on the condition scores, we had 1 through 4 on one of the illustrations, and then we had 1 through 5 in another. The fifth category was a not available category. On very few of the fish that were reflected in the pie charts, we didn't, for one reason or another, we didn't end up with data on those fish. So they didn't receive a score. Maybe we forgot to score them. Somebody didn't write down the rank in our notebook out in the field. So we had to have a rank for that. But it wasn't a condition score itself. It was just didn't receive a score. Whether they could be injured. So the question is, are larger fish more vulnerable? It's a good question. It's a complicated question to answer. For this particular fishery, we had to focus our efforts on the small animals because we know those were the ones that are being thrown back. I can tell you from experience working in commercial fisheries that you can look at it both ways. With very, very large individuals of any species, they have more surface area, they're exposed to more injury, and they can be, in some cases, depending upon the fishing gear type, they can die at a higher rate. But there's a lot of evidence in many, many studies that smaller individuals are more vulnerable. Physical injury-wise, they can be crushed easier if you're talking about a certain gear type that would put them in a situation where they could be crushed. Also, from a physiological point of view, they seem less resilient when they're smaller. Now, when these animals get much older, that's a great question. I think that would have a huge impact on the management of the species, on whether they were more susceptible to not only to injury but to stress when they're older. And I think particularly in the commercial fishery, that would play a big role, but that research has not been conducted, so we just don't know. Well, again, it depends a lot on the discard mortality, and that's why, one of the reasons we conducted the study as well is, if you're assuming that they're surviving at a high clip, you want to get them back in the water and discard them. And it is a backward sort of logic, but the bottom line is there's a balance there. You've got the animals that are dying, and you need to figure out how to best balance throwing back enough where you're not leading to high mortality rates, but you're also feeding the population by having them reproduce more and more. Now, even though the larger animals have more eggs, you're talking about, you saw the number of discarded small individuals. And those individuals totally, collectively, lead to a huge amount of production because, again, they are sexually mature at a lower size range than those animals. Once they reach 20, 21, 22 inches, they're long mature. They're already mature. They're already spawning. They're already going out and reproducing. I don't have data for you on how many eggs are in these small individuals just mature. It definitely scales quite largely, but it's not trivial, the amount of eggs they have and the amount of reproductive potential they have, even at that smaller size class. So I'm not sure that's answering your question. It's complicated. The discard mortality piece is only one facet of how they manage this species. So I give you a very, very simplistic, bare bones explanation of how that data influences the overall assessment. There are many other factors involved, including recruitment, how many new individuals are going to a population, how many young cod there are in a given stock. There's so many factors involved. So a person who is a fisheries analyst could probably answer that question a lot better than I could. That's a great question. The question is, how many people are exceeding their 9? And I mean, I can tell you from my own experience, I don't know if other people that fish recreationally would agree with this, but if you're out with 3 other people and you've caught your 9, you're going to keep fishing until the other people on the boat generally have their 9. Do you know what I mean? So I think it generally works that way. There's also high grading that's going on, and high grading happens often in the commercial fishery where you throw back by choice, not by law, but by choice, you throw back smaller fish and keep the bigger ones because they have more meat, more value. In the recreational fishery, even if you catch a fish that's legal, let's say the limit right now is 21 inches, and you catch a fish that's 22 or 23, but you're heavy into the cod and you're catching lots of cod that day, you're probably going to throw that fish back and wait for the bigger fish. Do you know what I mean? So even though the legal mandate would allow you to keep that fish, you're still going to throw it back. So I know that doesn't necessarily answer your question, but I know what you're saying. So if they attain the bag limit or, yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I haven't personally experienced that. I mean, every angler is different. I'm not sure what individual strategies are. I can tell you the people that I know and work with that generally people don't take a huge amount of, a lot of liberties. I think they understand that they're getting a pretty nice chunk of fish if they can keep 9 legal fish a day. If you catch 9 big cod, you're pretty psyched. So, I think in general that's understood, and hopefully people appreciate the fact that they shouldn't be cutting corners there. Yeah. That's a really good question too. The question is, how can you differentiate male and female cod? Are they what we call, are they sexually dimorphic? Can you tell the difference easily? Unfortunately not. My colleagues that conducted that study used a catheter. So they cannulated the animals by sticking a catheter into the cloaca, and they picked up any detection of hydrated eggs or sperm fluid was the telltale sign that it was either a male or female.